Well, thanks for coming today. I really appreciate your coming out, and this is a special occasion because, as Wendy said, I've been coming out here over the last couple of years, actually at the library here to get access to some of the old town meeting notes where William Prescott and his compatriots are all over those notes, and I'll talk about them a bit today. So thank you for having me and arranging this. So I'm Don Ryan, as Wendy said, and I've been a volunteer for the past 5 years. And typically I'm up on the battlefield, wandering around, greeting lots of folks. We get about 325 to 50,000 visitors a year at the park. Since COVID, it's been a lot smaller and not as many foreign visitors that we used to get. But oftentimes I'm wandering around close to the Prescott statue, which you might be familiar with. It's the only statue on the battlefield, and it's a fantastic statue. Sits on top of about a 6-foot-high plinth, and you've got Prescott striking this pose. I think I may have a picture of it later on with his sword out like that. And there's so many visitors that come up the steps from the museum and get in front of that statue and strike the same pose. People are on the ground, they're trying to get the monument in the background. And if I'm there and they see me in my volunteer outfit, they'll say, well, who is this guy? All it says is William Prescott on the base of it and the date of the battle. And so I figured in order to be a good guide, I needed to learn a lot about the colonel. And so I started diving into his background. And then when COVID hit and the park was really closed, I thought, okay, I'm assembling all these notes. What should I do with them? And long story short, a number of historians that I had interacted with had said, well, why don't you write a book? You've got time on your hands now, why don't you write a book? And I said, well, I haven't written a book before. I've been published in other areas, but that sounds like a big undertaking. And they said, go for it. You know, one of them was Nat Philbrick, who wrote Bunker Hill, Paul Lockhart, who wrote Whites of Their Eyes, Christian Despigna, who's written a biography a few years ago about Joseph Warren, John Furling, who's now retired but has written probably a dozen books on the Revolution. They all said, go for it. You know, nothing's been really written about the colonel in a very, very long time. So I was aimed to try to complete this work in time for the 250th anniversary of the battle. And actually yesterday I was at the Bunker Hill Museum where I was meeting with the head of the Bunker Hill Monument Association, the Charlestown Historical Society. They're already planning for the events that are going to be in June of 2025. In fact, they're talking about actually doing a reenactment of the battle, which would be kind of interesting, that's for sure. Anyway, so what I'm hoping to do today is acquaint you a little further with this fantastic American hero. You know, I sort of got into this at the time, realizing that not many people know about Prescott, and that's not unusual if you think back on, you know, military generals and so forth. You know, how many remember the major generals from World War I or even World War II, other than maybe Patton and Eisenhower and a few other people? So I really want to revive his fame. That was kind of my objective in getting into this project, and of course doing these kinds of talks. So I'm going to ask you to hold questions until I get through the material. I have a lot here. I've timed it out. It's going to take me about an hour, but I think we can have time afterward for Q&A. Okay? The other thing I'll mention is there's a little clipboard I've left on the round table over here. My agent will kill me if I don't say this. The book is not ready yet. It's not ready for purchase. But he said, when you do these talks, ask people if they're interested in keeping updates on when it's going to come out. So if you're interested, there's no obligation, but you can sign your name there and maybe put your email address. I'll put you on a list, okay? All right, here we go. At about 4:30 in the morning on Saturday, June 17th, 1775, a single cannon shot broke the morning silence with a loud boom. And the American soldiers who were on top of Breed's Hill reflexively turned toward the sound and saw a cloud of white smoke coming out from the Falcon, one of 7 British warships that were anchored in the Charles River. The cannonball that it fired traced a steep arc, reached its peak, and then descended, whistling like an overheated tea kettle. And I mention that because the soldiers actually referred to the bombs as tea kettles with that whistling sound. Luckily for them, the ball crashed into the side of the hill and didn't hit the fort. In fact, none of the cannonballs that are going to be fired throughout the morning and early afternoon actually hit the fort on top of the hill. British couldn't get their cannon elevated high enough. But nonetheless, it terrified the people that were there, who weren't expecting it. You know, they had come over, I'll explain in a minute, they came over to provide a defensive barrier up in that area to prevent the British from going across Charlestown Neck into Cambridge. But after that first cannon shot, some of the other warships in the harbor started firing their guns, and this was essentially the beginning of the Battle of Bunker Hill. Let me take a second just to acquaint you with some of the key players in this historic day. So up in the upper left, we have Military Governor General Thomas Gage. He's an aristocrat. He came over, fought in the French and Indian War. In fact, he fought alongside a young squire from Virginia by the name of George Washington. He ends up marrying an American girl, Margaret Kemble, from New Jersey. He married a Jersey girl. So how bad can he be, right? And it's interesting because there have been rumors that it was Margaret Kemble who is Joseph Warren's informant on a number of the things that they learned about the battle plans of the British and so forth. I haven't seen any definitive evidence of that. I think there are some television shows that have also kind of hinted at that. But it's highly likely that she provided some information to him. I think she was actually a patient of Dr. Warren. To the right is General William Howe. He's going to be the field commander during the battle. Okay, he's the British's finest light infantry commander in their army. And the King George III has asked him specifically to come over and help put down the uprising that's happening in the Massachusetts colony. He doesn't want to go. He says, I don't have a beef with the Americans. You know? But the king kind of insists, no, I really need you to do this. So he agrees to come over. On the lower left is General Henry Clinton. He actually spent part of his youth in New York. His father was a royal governor in New York. And so he spent a number of years here. He then goes back to England, finishes his schooling, gets into the military, and here he's coming back as a general. And on the lower right, we have General John Burgoyne. I'm going to talk about him a little bit later in the presentation. Gentleman John. And it's interesting because he refers to the three of them as the triumvirate of reputation. And he's a little full of himself. And he makes a couple of disparaging remarks about Gage and how Gage doesn't have the competency to put down this rabble. And they're coming over to kind of pull his keister out of the fire, so to speak. They actually come over. Gage becomes military governor after the Boston Tea Party, which is December of '73. By the time he gets word from the king that he's going to be the new military governor, it's May of '74. These three generals come over a year later in May of '75, and they sail across to America on the aptly named ship, the Cerberus. Now, if you're not familiar with Greek mythology, the Cerberus is the three-headed dog with snakes protruding from its body that guards the underworld for King Hades, the king of the dead. So I thought, isn't that interesting? You've got these three guys coming over on the Cerberus. Okay, on the American side, I've highlighted just two people here. Dr. and General Joseph Warren. He, at this point, is the president of the provincial government. John Hancock is down in Philadelphia, and he's elected to be the second president. They've set up this Congress after, you know, the charter had been abrogated by the king, but the colonists said, well, we want to have our own people guide us, so they elect first Hancock and then Joseph Warren. He's a local guy from Roxbury, went to Harvard, becomes a physician. He's running one of the largest medical practices in Boston. He's John Adams and John Hancock's personal physician. He's inoculated the citizens of Boston against smallpox in the late 60s. He's written the Suffolk Resolves. He's the head of the Committee of Correspondence, the Committee of Safety. The guy is all over the place. He's twice given the oration recognizing the anniversary of the Boston Massacre, March 5th of 1770. everybody knows him, and he's highly regarded. To the lower left is General Artemus Ward from Shrewsbury. Shrewsbury, as you may know, is in central part of Massachusetts. And he fought in the French and Indian War. He's now at this time in charge of the New England troops. And he's directed by Ward to protect Charlestown Heights and Dorchester Heights, because an informant that Warren calls a gentleman of unquestioned veracity has told him that the British are intending to attack Charlestown and Dorchester on the on the morning of Sunday the 18th, when he thinks that most people are going to be in bed or asleep, or at church. And so he says, let's get over there, get the high ground before they do. And so it's Ward that gives the orders to Colonel Prescott to defend Charlestown Heights. And there's the statue that I was referring to earlier, if you haven't seen that. By the way, I live right across the street over there in one of those buildings, just out of camera range. Anyway, his orders are specifically to possess and fortify Bunker's Hill. Now, George Bunker was a landowner in Charlestown at the time, and his property is back on the west part of the peninsula, close to Charlestown Neck and Cambridge. As we know, the battle doesn't happen on Bunker Hill, even though that's where they were told to build their fort. So Prescott, as you may know, is a fourth-generation farmer and civic administrator from the patriotic town of Pepperell, Massachusetts. His great-grandfather, we were talking about this a little earlier, his great-grandfather comes here in 1640 and settles in Watertown initially, but in seeking his fortunes, he moves out to the frontier, which was kind of central Massachusetts at the time, and he founds the town of Lancaster. And his descendants start spreading out. One of his sons, actually it's his youngest child, Jonas, moves to Groton and becomes one of the early settlers in Groton. Prescott inherits his farm here. I hope I'm not telling you what you already know, but he inherits a 120-acre farm from his father, Benjamin, who dies suddenly at the age of 42, when William is only 12 years old. So he's pretty young in that family. It's a family of 7 children, 4 daughters and 3 sons. He has an older brother, James, and a younger brother, Oliver, who are pretty well known in their own regards in Groton. And, they become kind of the head of the household, with their mother kind of taking care of the farm. He expands that farm to about 250 acres, and he calls it the Highlands. Now, Prescott had fought with the British in King George's War in the 1740s and in the French and Indian War in the 1750s. In fact, he acquitted himself so well that the British offered him a commission in their army. He turns them down and says, I'm going to go back to my farm in Pepperell, thank you very much. He ends up marrying Abigail Hale from Sutton, Massachusetts in April of 1758. They have only one child, William Jr., which is kind of interesting because, when you're looking at these families back then, these colonial families, they tended to have 8, 10, 12, 14 children. They're farmers. 90% of New Englanders were farmers at this point, and they needed labor. I mean, the children end up being largely, a source of labor supply. But they only have one child. It's about 4 years after their marriage, and it led me to kind of wonder, did they have a hard time conceiving? Did she have some problems otherwise? But very unusual to have just one child then. William actually has 4 children, and one of them is William Hickling Prescott, who becomes one of the most famous historians of the age. In fact, if you go to the Massachusetts Historical Society, where I've also been poring over original documents, they have the William Hickling Prescott papers there, and some of the materials that I end up finding out about William are buried deep in his files. Actually, I should tell you, William Jr. is also a very renowned jurist in the state. Actually, probably one of the most famous jurists during his time. He had gone to Harvard as well. Prescott is 49 years old at the time of the battle, so he's not a spring chicken at this point. And he heads the militia from Pepperell, Groton, and Hollis, New Hampshire. So one of the first questions I had for myself was, okay, how did Prescott get from loyal British subject, fighting in the wars alongside the British, to now all of a sudden he's standing up on Breed's Hill, getting ready for this battle with the British. How did he get there? And actually that's where this library came into effect, because I was able to, I don't know, is Deborah Spratt here by any chance? I don't see her. No. But do you know Deborah?
Today, she apologized. She couldn't.
Oh, that's okay. But I came here, the first time I came here, I set up some time with Deborah, and I said what I was doing. And she put me upstairs in a little history room, and I was at the end of the table. If you know, it's kind of a long table. And she went into a locked room in the back, and then she came out like this, carrying this red-bound book across to me, and she put it down in front of me. And she gave me some white gloves to wear and a magnifying glass, which turned out to be the most important thing that I got that day. If you look at any of those notes, it's pretty tough. And then she left me alone to go back to her job and close the door. And I sat there thinking, like, this is the equivalent of, like, the Book of Kells or the Dead Sea Scrolls. And so every time I turned the page, I sort of went like, I was just afraid I was going to tear something out or, hurt this document. But it ended up being very, very important. In there, you find out that Pepperell opposes the Stamp Act in 1765. And as I said earlier, Prescott is all over these pages. So there'll be notes from various town meetings, and it'll have the list of the selectmen or whoever's there. and that's how I made these connections. In the late 60s and into the early 70s, Samuel Adams is pushing a policy of non-importation of British goods. These are because after all the taxes have been levied on the colonists in the 60s. And you see Pepperell supporting this activity, which is very interesting. And then there's something called the Boston Pamphlet, which comes out in 1772 at the end of the year. And in January of 73, the town of Pepperell responds to the Boston Pamphlet, which is Samuel Adams and Joseph Warren co-authoring a document that says, hey, as British Americans, we have rights, and they're being trampled right now by the policies of Parliament. And, we need to stand up for it. Prescott actually pens 2 letters. He's not a letter writer. He doesn't leave a diary. Unfortunately, there weren't tape recorders or typewriters back in those days. He was too busy being a farmer and all the other things he was doing. But one of the letters he sends in June of '74 is a short letter to the citizens of Boston. And he says, from the ever patriotic town of Pepperell, Massachusetts, we are sending 40 bushels of grain. And that was because the harbor had been closed during the Boston Tea Party, after the Boston Tea Party, and things were getting very tough for the citizens of Boston just to really survive. There's another letter that shows up later on. There's no date on it, but it's suspected that it's also in that latter part of that year. And I'll show it to you in a second. I actually wrote it out here. I'm not going to read the whole thing. But he's basically supporting the citizens of Boston and saying, we're going to sink or swim together. The other thing, of course, he does is he marches the militia to Concord in April 19th, '75. The famous Paul Revere's ride out from Boston to Concord to alert them that the British are coming. And I thought this was pretty remarkable. And we were talking earlier about the fact that in a lot of these cases, in these battles, the soldiers are often walking large distances to get to the fight. And so I ended up talking to a professor at Brandeis University who's written a lot about the colonial era. And one of the questions I was asking him about was, how did people get around? And were people walking in these crazy distances? And he said, actually, they did. And he said, have you ever wondered why a lot of the early colonial towns were about 15 to 18 miles separate from one another? I said, Brian, I never really thought about that. And he said that was because that was considered the distance that somebody would be willing to walk in a day. And so the towns were kind of spread out. And it made me think about, imagine some husband in Boston yelling up to his wife, oh, honey, I'm going over to Ebenezer Smith's house in Lexington to drop a few things off, and then I'll be right back. So I'll see you in about 8 hours, unless I step off the road at a rest stop, and then it might be 9 hours. But that's what it was like. It would take that long to do that. So they're going to march down from Pepperell and Groton. They get word about 9 o'clock in the morning that the British soldiers are in Concord, and he assembles the militia, and off they go. Now, that's about a 20-mile walk. Even at a brisk 4-mile-an-hour pace, that's 5 hours of walking, right? And then they're going to fight. He actually gets to Concord in the mid-afternoon, but the British are already gone. They've already hightailed it back to Boston and safety. And does he stop there? No. He gets on Battle Road and is chasing them down to Boston. And this is kind of an interesting part of the story because, you know, the British suffer almost 300 casualties coming out of that Concord alarm. The Americans by now have assembled about 4,000 militia that are lining the roadway, and it's a gauntlet that they're marching back in. The original group of about 800 have been reinforced by about another 700. So there's about 1,500 British, but about 4,000 Americans along the route back. And rather than go all the way to Boston Neck, which is the little bit of land that connects the mainland with the peninsula that is Boston at the time. I have a map of it here. I pulled it out in the interest of time. But the British decide not to walk all the way to Boston Neck, but instead divert themselves across Charlestown Neck to go up to Bunker's Hill, where they bivouac for the night. Now think about that. They just took over the heights, slept overnight, got ferried back to Boston across the Charles River. So they voluntarily gave up the territory that then 2 months later they're going to come back over armed and having to fight to get that same land. So isn't that ironic? Here are a couple of quotes that I have and that response from the Boston pamphlet. Actually, can we turn the light, can one of these lights go down? It might be easier to see some of this. This is actually a darker blue. I don't know. Anybody know where the light switch is back there?
Which one are you looking for?
Just to get this a little darker so they can see this maybe. Is that better? Oh, now we got it. Sure. Okay. So here's responding to that Boston pamphlet. This comes out of the material here in your library. Gentlemen, you will be so good as to inform the town of Boston that we have received their letter, together with the pamphlet setting forth our liberties as men, as Christians, as subjects, with the infringements which have been made upon them. And he goes on, you know, we are greatly alarmed at the large strides which have been made by the enemies of our excellent Constitution down here. We stand ready to cooperate with them in all measure warranted by the Constitution. Here's a letter that the folks of Pepperell sent to James Prescott, his older brother, who was part of the General Assembly. And look how it starts. Sir, we, His Majesty's loyal and dutiful subjects. So here we are, you know, pretty close to the outbreak of hostilities, but the colonists still consider themselves loyal subjects. Their beef is really with the Parliament. And even after the Battle of Bunker Hill, they're sending the olive branch petition to the king saying, we're still loyal to you, which is remarkable. You know, so it takes a while before they finally start attacking the king. Okay, so what do they say? Being ever ready to give due assistance and encouragement to government in a constitutional way, we cannot but be greatly affected by the frequent innovations which have been made on our happy Constitution. You know, we want him. They're saying we want you to represent us and you know, stand fast against the British. In this one, I think this is where they talk about. I'll just focus down here, and you can come up after the presentation if you want to see this more closely. We will not have any hand in the consumption of East India tea, British goods, or merchandise imported after the last day of August. So this is part of that non-importation. We're not going to buy your goods. And that's June of '74. This is that letter that Prescott sends himself that's discovered years later by George Bancroft. And you know, he says, be not dismayed or disheartened in this great day of trials. And he talks about you know, knowing that Providence has placed you where you must stand in the first shocks. We consider that we are all embarked in one bottom. We must sink or swim together. It's really a fantastic letter. In my book, I say, I don't think Samuel Adams could have written a better letter than this letter. Okay, so back to the battle. Here it is, Friday night. Ward has told Prescott that he's got to come over and possess and fortify Bunker's Hill. They assemble in Harvard Square. in the late afternoon, and Prescott has given 1,100 troops to come over to Charlestown and build this defensive fortification. And they march over the 3.5 miles. It's going to take them about an hour to get there. They arrive close to midnight, all right? Now, this is interesting because now they're going to try to decide, where do we put the fort? And one of the resources I was happy to get acquainted with was a former colonel of the U.S. Army who's now a senior researcher for the War College. And he was introduced to me by a high school friend that had gone to West Point. And so I was talking with this guy, Jim Scudieri, and he said, what were they doing? They come in at midnight. They're trying to figure out where to put a fort in the dark? How crazy is that? And they actually reconnoiter the whole waterfront in Charlestown. Prescott takes a number of the men. They're so close to the warships in the harbor that they can hear the sailors talking to each other. All right, they're that close. They come back up from Charlestown Village, and they make their way up. The first major promontory they come to is Breed's Hill. And it's there that General Israel Putnam suggests they put the fort there. That seems to be what I've gathered from the research I've done. Richard Gridley, who's the engineer who's going to design the fort, says, but our orders say to put it back on Bunker's Hill. Bunker's Hill is 110 feet above sea level. Breed's Hill is only 62. But it was closer. Putnam's argument is, we're closer. I'm going to show you a map of this in a second. We can see what's going on over in Boston, and this would be a good place to put the fort. It's elevated. We can defend the position. My good friend now, the former colonel, said they were disobeying orders. Their orders were to put the fort back at Bunker's Hill. And where they put it, that was a provocation to the British. The British could see them there. They probably wouldn't have seen them if you were about 1/3 of a mile further west. Okay? Hang on. Hit the wrong button. All right, here's this map. And I won't spend a lot of time on it because I just talked about it a bit. But here's Charlestown Neck, and you got Cambridge over here. Here's where Bunker's Hill is. Here's where the fort's going to be built on Breed's Hill. Breed's another landowner. The area was just beginning to be called Breed's Hill at the time. A lot of people refer to this whole ridge as the Charlestown Heights. So you could maybe give them a little bit of leeway to say, well, they were defending the Charlestown Heights. So here's the village down here that's going to get burned in the battle, right? The British are going to send incendiary bombs there and burn that down. So here are where the Americans are building the fort. The fort is basically a rectangle, 140 feet by 120. It's a 6-foot-high dirt wall with a little exit in the back and a trough in the front, so it would be hard for people to climb into it. The British are going to come over from Copp's Hill. This is the north end of Boston, you know, the Italian section where all the great restaurants are. They're going to come over about 1 o'clock in the afternoon. So they take a long time before they get themselves organized. They have to wait for the tide to be right. And they're going to land down here along the waterfront. And this is where the Spalding Rehabilitation Hospital is now. And it's called Morton's Point or Moulton's Hill at the time. The British are going to get here. They're going to lounge around. They have their lunch. They're taking it easy. They don't think it's going to be a big deal to get the Americans off the hill. As I said, there are 7 warships in here: the Cerberus, the Glasgow, the Falcon, the Lively, the Somerset, the Spitfire, and the Symmetry are the 7 ships that are out there. Okay? The last thing I'll mention is, see this little area right here? This is the Mystic River. Charles River is on this side. This area right here is where the hottest fighting is going to occur. This area right down to the beach is where the stone wall is going to be erected about an hour before the battle. The rail fence is this area that's heading up towards the fort. Now the rail fence is kind of an infamous area here because they've basically taken down fences from people's property and they're building this continuous fence that's going to go, they're trying to get it all the way up to the fort. They don't get it done in time. There's a gap of about 150 feet, which unfortunately for the Americans, the British spot during the battle, and they're going to exploit that gap. But the Connecticut troops with Thomas Knowlton and Stark's men are going to array themselves down there, and that's where actually the hottest fighting occurs. So keep those places a bit in mind as I go through the rest of this. All right, so here we have Prescott is commanding the redoubt. He's up at the top of the fort, and it's still the morning. bombs are, raining in on the side of the hill. As I said, they're embedding themselves in the side of the hill, not hitting the fort. But at some point, one of the cannonballs comes in at a lower trajectory, and it skips along the ground like a stone across a pond, and it pops up and it decapitates one of the volunteers from Billerica, Asa Pollard, 35 years old. Shears his head right off. And Prescott is so close to Pollard when this happens, and he writes about this afterward. He said that Pollard's blood and brains splattered my coat. All right? He said, I picked up some fresh dirt on the ground, and I brushed it off. I think I would have fainted if that did happen to me. He's like, okay, no big deal. The men say to him, we'd like to stop our work. We want to hold a religious ceremony and bury our friend Pollard. And he says, there's not time for this. The British know we're here. They're not happy about it. They're going to come over here. There's likely going to be a big battle. We got to get this work done. He's kind of stern with them. And he says, bury him. And he kind of marches off, supposedly waggling his sword. And then he looks back and he sees the men are terror-stricken, right? And he then does a remarkable thing. He climbs up on top of the redoubt, right? Oops, hang on, wrong button. Don't look at those slides. He climbs up on this 6-foot wall, and he starts walking back and forth, and he's telling the men, come on, get it done. The British are going to come here. We're going to have a big battle. We have to get this done. Now, he's 6'2". The average American is 5'8". Male American is 5'8". He's like the perfect target for these cannonballs. But here he is. He's striding along like this, and he's saying, you have nothing to worry about, right? He's up there on the top of the wall. And he's so brazen that he gets to the southeast corner of this redoubt that they've built, the closest part over towards Copp's Hill. Remember Copp's Hill? And he turns towards the British, and he tips his hat and gives them a little wave. Like, we know you're coming. We're going to be ready for you. We're not backing down. And it's interesting because he suspected that there might have been some British over there, and in fact there were. In fact, in Copp's Hill, Thomas Gage, the military governor, is up there. And with him is an aide, a senior aide by the name of Abijah Willard. Abijah Willard was an American who stayed loyal to the British. And Gage gives Willard his spyglass and says, tell me what's going on over there. And he looks through the spyglass and he says, it's Prescott. And he knows it's Prescott because he's Prescott's brother-in-law. Yeah, it's Prescott's brother-in-law. He had married his older sister, Elizabeth, and Gage says to him, is he going to fight? And he said, he's an old soldier, but he's going to fight you to his last drop of blood. And he knows that because the two of them, Willard and Prescott, had met here in Prescott's house several weeks before the battle. And Willard is giving him a warning, saying, this is after Lexington and Concord, so there's been some fighting already. He says, things are getting pretty, I'm going to paraphrase, things are getting pretty testy here. If you end up on the wrong side, you could lose your property, you could lose your wealth, you might even lose your life. And Prescott's response is, I have given thought to that matter, and I find it highly probable that you will find me in arms, meaning I'm going to be with the Americans. And he says, and I will not be taken alive. The Tories will not have the satisfaction of seeing me hanged. All right, so that's what he tells Willard. So Willard says to Gage, I can't vouch for the other men that are up there, but Prescott's going to fight you to the gates of hell. And Gage says, then we have to carry the works, meaning we have to go over and take them off the top of the hill. And that's when he decides to move the battle plan from Sunday the 18th to Saturday the 17th. Pretty remarkable. All right, I've mentioned some of these people already. I'll go through them quickly. Israel Putnam is a very well-known general from the French Indian War. Old Put is his nickname. He's been advocating strong action against the British. He's there, overnight with Prescott when they're deciding where to put the fort. And it's interesting because some historians have called him the hero of Bunker Hill. And I take great offense at that. Because he's never in the fighting. He never gives any commands to anybody. He never gives a command to, say, Prescott or anyone else. He's never in the redoubt. He's riding around like a crazy man on the peninsula. But how they decide he's the hero, I don't know. Anyway, when this book comes out, it'll straighten everybody out. Meanwhile, Colonel Stark, okay, he's from New Hampshire. He's also fought in the French and Indian War. He's 47 years old as well. And he's an avid patriot. In fact, when he heard about the fighting in Lexington and Concord, he immediately dropped what he was doing on his farm, got on his horse, and rode down to Cambridge. And he decided he was going to volunteer for the Army. And he raises more men, actually, than any other commander. He has a really loyal following. So loyal that, I don't know if you can see that in the back, but at the bottom it says, "Live free or die." Do you know what that's from? Don't know. Okay, if you look at the New Hampshire license plate, it says "Live free or die" on it. And that's John Stark, because when John Stark was in his 80s, and he's going to live to be in his 90s, in his 80s, his soldiers sent him an invitation to come to a reunion of the troops. And he's infirm, he can't travel, so he pens a note, and he writes, "Live free or die. There are worse things than death." All right, so these are the people that the British are going to be dealing with. One of his troops had an interesting comment and said, "When you're with him, you knew you were in the presence of a dangerous man." And he's a fierce fighter. He's very interesting to read about. I mentioned Captain Thomas Knowlton, who reports to Putnam. He's along the slope there, heading down towards the Mystic River. He's got about 200 to 300 Connecticut militia with him, and they're building the rail fence. He's 33 years old. He was born in Massachusetts. I forget what town. Moved when he was 8 to Connecticut. He's raised a militia. Here he is. He's up there. He's got them all lined up. His kind of fun fact is that he's credited with having founded the U.S. Intelligence Service. So when you think about the CIA or the FBI or those kinds of things, it goes back to Thomas Knowlton, what he did in the Revolutionary War. In fact, one of the highest awards you can get in the CIA is called the Thomas Knowlton Award. He becomes a big favorite of George Washington. Okay, it's 3 o'clock in the afternoon. The battle's about to begin. Now, at this point, the cannonading stops. All right, it's been going on all morning into the afternoon. Now it stops. And an eerie quiet falls on the battlefield. The Americans know, okay, now we're going to have the troops coming. So put yourself in their shoes. I want you to think about standing behind that dirt wall, right, that you've just built overnight. You've probably never shot a weapon at another person before in your life, right? You also probably know that many of you, your friends and neighbors, are going to die today, probably in the next couple of hours. The British are lining up, right? They're lining up in line formation across the field. They can see them all the way down to the waterfront. It's about a half mile, but there are no trees or residential structures at that time. And Howe's got his men lined up. Now, in the fort, Prescott is telling his men, and Stark is credited with this too, they're telling them 3 things. First thing is, you're in an elevated position up here. Your tendency is going to be to shoot too high over their heads. So we want you to aim at their waistbands and below. Secondly, we want you to pick off the officers. Look for the men in the handsome suits, they call them, the handsome suits. And that was very controversial. In the 1700s, officers were off limits in these fighting. If you were in Europe, the officers kind of stood aside and the regulars did all the fighting. But here we're saying, pick off the officers, all right? We've been through the French and Indian War. We know what Indian fighting is like, and that's what we're going to do. And the third thing, and most famously, not going to give you the command to fire until we see the whites of their eyes. Now, historians don't know if anybody actually uttered those words, but they said something like that. And I've seen most references I've seen have attributed that to Prescott. Apparently, Stark said something. He's down along the beach. He said, "We're not going to fire until we can see the whites of their gaiters." Okay, so that was his version of the same thing. So here's the battle plan for Howe. He's got about 1,600 troops. Half of them are lined up here under Major Robert Piggott. They're going to do a direct assault right at the fort. All right? Howe has told Gage, in a half hour, I will knock the rabble off the hill. In fact, I'm not even sure they're going to fight us. And when we start coming up the hill, they're going to hightail it. And he's so arrogant about it that this is not the kind of formation you would have when you're attacking a fortified elevated position. You would normally come up in column formation. Here, all his men are like targets immediately, right? They're across the field. Pickett is going to start up right after 3 o'clock, but he's meant to be a diversion. Howe is hoping that the Americans will focus on those troops, and instead, he is going to be riding himself on the right side of the battlefield along the river. And his plan is to come up behind the American fort and trap them there. Now, interestingly, John Stark arrives at the battlefield about an hour before the battle. Prescott has been sending people walking back to Harvard Square to get some reinforcements. It takes about an hour to get there. It's too bad they didn't have, something better, but they didn't. And finally, Ward relents and says to Stark, take 200 troops and go over there. And he arrives, he comes up to the fort, sees Prescott, says, oh, the fort looks pretty good, but if the British come up along the river and get behind you, you're trapped. And Prescott says, you're right. Why don't you go down there and do what you can? And that's when they start building the stone wall, about 3-foot high stone wall, and the rail fence. So Stark's down there, he's getting his men arrayed. Between Stark and Prescott is Knowlton and his men. Now I'll do a little, I'm glad we have a little musket over here that Wendy brought in. I actually had a instruction meeting yesterday with the fellow in Charlestown that does the live firing, and so it was very curious. I sort of knew this information, but I'd love to get it firsthand. So the British are carrying what's called the Brown Bess musket. It's the state-of-the-art musket, which actually isn't saying a whole lot, but I'll get into that in a second. It's state-of-the-art. This musket gets used for like another 50 years or 70 years, something like that. It's 5 feet tall. Now remember, the average height of a man is 5'8", so it's almost as tall as a man. Weighs 10 pounds, and it has a 17-inch bayonet on the end of it. Okay? It fires a 69 or 67 caliber round. It's about 3/4 of an inch in circumference, musket ball, at 1,000 feet per second. That's about a second. That's going to go over 330 yards and hit a target. So once you hear the sound, you don't have a whole lot of time to duck. It's a very powerful weapon. That speed is about almost 700 miles an hour. All right. As this fellow was explaining yesterday, it wouldn't just hit you and kind of get embedded in your body. It would blow right through your torso and leave a bigger exit wound than the wound that's going in. So if you don't get killed immediately, you're going to probably bleed out. All right, that's how devastating this weapon is. In fact, Alexander Hamilton, in July of 1804, is going to find this out when he fights his famous duel with Aaron Burr. Right, he's standing there. They fire at each other, although we don't know if Hamilton actually fired at Burr, but he gets hit in the side, and he isn't killed. Hamilton's doctor comes out and sees him, and Hamilton looks at his wound and he says, it's a fatal wound. I mean, he knows from the war what that musket ball can do. But it's a flawed weapon. There's no sighting mechanism on the top. It's not a rifled barrel. So the ball in there is kind of moving along, and when it comes out, it can go in almost any direction. The effective range is about 50 yards if you want to hit something. It can kill you at 175 yards because it's going at such high speed. Also, you're dealing with powder. Powder can get damp. It can misfire. The fellow I spoke with yesterday said about a quarter of the time those muskets would misfire. That's pretty tough. When the British start attacking and they've got a 17-inch bayonet charging at you and you're pouring your powder in saying, oh my God, I hope this is the 3/4 of the time that it's going to work. Because if it doesn't, if you get a false firing, they're going to be on top of you. And that's Howe's plan. Howe's plan is when they shoot their volley, we're going to attack. And they're either going to flee or we'll get on top of them, and we're trained how to use the bayonet. All right? You notice that they shoot in a volley. The idea is you just don't stand there kind of onesie-twosie shooting. Everybody's going to shoot at the same time and send kind of a sheet of metal at the opponent. And that's where, if you're on the other side of that, if you don't get hit, Now you're going to hear charge, and you're going to rush these people, because it takes about at least 15 seconds. I've seen them do this demonstration. I think it's more like 20, 25 seconds to reload. And that's when you're standing on a Saturday afternoon in Charlestown in 2023, right? It's not like, oh my God, there's this guy in the corner of my eye, he's charging at me with a bayonet right now. And you're putting powder in, and you're putting the wadding down, and you get your ramrod out, you're doing all these steps. And so what the Americans do, this both Prescott in the fort and Stark along the stone wall and rail fence, they fought in the French Indian War with the British. They line their men up 3 deep. And the idea is, when we give you the command to fire, the first row is going to get up, fire, step aside, start reloading. Second row, up, aim, fire, step aside. By the time the third person has got up and fire, the first person is reloaded. So as long as the British are still charging, and we've got musket balls, we're going to keep shooting at them. And it becomes essentially a shooting gallery, as I'll talk about in a second. Okay, so here comes Piggott up on the left flank. He's marching up. The men in the fort are waiting. Prescott's walking back and forth saying, hold your fire. Don't anybody shoot. Don't fire. Actually, one of the soldiers does fire. I think it's, I'll have to go back. I think it's somebody from Groton. I don't know how you feel about your neighbors in Groton, but somebody in Groton shoots their weapon, and Prescott gets pretty ticked off, and he threatens severe punishment if somebody disobeys orders again. So he's waiting. Here they come. The British are coming uphill. It's a hot day. They're wearing woolen uniforms. They're carrying backpacks that weigh 30 to 110 pounds because they're going to occupy the territory. The grass isn't mowed, and they're not walking on, wood chips or something. They're pushing themselves through about knee-high grass. There are rocks and holes, and it's not an easy walk, but up they come. They get very, very close. And finally, when Prescott feels they were in range, he gives the command to fire, and the first group steps up. They've cut little steps into the side of the wall that they've built so they can get up higher, lean over, and shoot. About 2 minutes later, Howe arrives on the right side. He's bringing up his troops along the Mystic River, just like John Stark guessed that's what he would do. Howe is on a horse. Next to him is an aide carrying a tray with a decanter of wine. All right, and they're kind of sauntering into the battle. And Howe's expecting, the rabble's going to run here. This is even going to be a fight. To the right of him, right along the beach, are the Welsh Fusiliers, an elite fighting force. To the left of them are the Grenadiers, another elite fighting force. And I saw a description of them. It's kind of interesting. They are the tallest, the handsomest, and the fiercest fighter in the army. And they have the honor of leading the charge. I think they didn't want the honor this particular day, because when the fighting starts, and it's withering fire, the Welsh Fusiliers have 90% casualties. The Grenadiers, over 80% casualties. I mean, they're that close. I didn't mention this, but Stark had actually gone out into the field in front of the rail fence and stone wall, and he hammered little wooden stakes in the ground about 40 yards out. And he told his men, we're not going to fire until the British are inside that. Now, 40 yards. I mean, have you been on a football field lately? That's pretty close, right? And this is the British Army. They outnumber you, they have better weapons, they're better trained, they have better leaders. How those men stood there, I have no idea. It's just incredible. The fighting starts there a couple of minutes after the redoubt is under attack. One of the survivors said, we just melted away. Like the whole front line is just going down. The assault stops, the men fall back, they regroup, Americans are cheering. Prescott says to his men, it's not over. They're going to get lined up again and come back. We have to be ready for them. And sure enough, about 15 minutes later, Howe has his men lined up. Same formation across the field. Up we go, second try. Now on this one, this is really interesting because a couple of months after the battle, Prescott writes a letter in response to an inquiry from John Adams, who wants to know what happened up there. And he describes, he says, I'm kind of busy right now to write you a long message, but essentially I was given orders to defend Breed's Hill, he says in this letter. No, those weren't the orders, sir. But he says on the second assault, I let the troops get to within about 30 yards of the fort. Now that's really close. And then he starts firing. And now there are hundreds of bodies either dead or dying on the battlefield, right? They're talking about the grass being stained with the blood of the British soldiers. Prescott says, I saw Howe standing in the field. He was stunned. And sure enough, after the battle, years later, he says, the hottest fighting I ever had in my whole career was at the rail fence at Bunker Hill. And he describes the second assault. He says, it was a moment I had never felt before. Right? He couldn't believe that the Americans, who he called a rabble, actually had stopped his troops. So at this point, Henry Clinton, remember Henry Clinton? He's over in the North End looking through a spyglass and realizing, you know, this isn't going the way we thought it was going to go. So he comes over with 400 more troops. He tells the men, take off your backpacks, take off these coats. It's a warm June day. And he and Howe say, we're going to go up in column formation. They finally get some, and they're going to come up at like 4 abreast. And Howe says, forget about the stone wall, rail fence. We're never going to penetrate that. But there's a gap that he had spotted on the second assault. He said, we're going to aim in there. We're going to capture the fort. That's what we're going to do. We're not going to stop in the battlefield and shoot. This is just going to be a charge, and it's going to be hand-to-hand combat with that musket and bayonet. So here's the third assault. It's the last assault. Takes the British 3 times. Unfortunately, the Americans are essentially out of ammunition at this point. And this is where, and you can probably tell I'm a Prescott fan, but this is where I kind of worry about his judgment. He tells his men, he knows he's low on ammunition, very low, but he tells them, if we can hold them off one more time, I think we'll break their spirit. And so the men stay with him. They don't flee. They're now putting rocks, nails, any kind of projectile down the barrel because they have no musket balls left, and a lot of them are out of powder. They're just standing there holding their musket like a club. They're just waiting for, here come the British. So up they come, a scattering of fire ends. The British are now climbing into the fort from multiple sides. It becomes hand-to-hand combat. Colonel Prescott is first in the redoubt, fighting them. The descriptions I've read are he's parrying the thrusts of the bayonet with this short sword that he has. Right? They're piercing his banyan coat that he's wearing. He's that close to them. They're not shooting. They've been told not to shoot. They're afraid of shooting each other in like a friendly fire thing. He's doing this, but he realizes, oh my God, you know, there's too many people coming in. So he starts backing up towards the exit in the back of the fort, and he waves his sword over his head, and that's a signal of retreat. The Americans see it. They start running back. They're throwing their bodies over the back wall. The exit that they built is only about as wide as a doorway. So try to put 200 men through that, you know, when you're being chased by the British. They're just throwing themselves over the top. And Prescott doesn't get wounded. He's not captured. And he's obviously not killed. And he's going to walk all the way back to Cambridge after the battle. But unfortunately, Joseph Warren, who is also in the fort, did I skip the part where he had arrived before the battle? I think I did. I was rushing along. I got too excited. About an hour before the battle, or less than that, Dr. Warren, who's been nursing a headache in Cambridge, hears about the fact that Prescott needs help and that the British are lining up for this battle. And he gets up, mixes himself a little elixir, liquid Tylenol, I guess, puts on his finest clothes, and he heads over to the fort. He gets up to the redoubt, the fort, where Putnam and Prescott are. This is before the fighting. And now Warren has been named Major General for the New England forces 3 days before the battle. And when Prescott sees him, he offers him command because he knows he outranks him. And Warren says, you know, I haven't had my official ceremony yet. I'm still a civilian, but I want to fight. And they say, you don't belong here. He's the president of their government. It would be like saying, you know, Maura Healey is up there, you know, and she's going to fight in a battle. And they're like, you're too young and this is too dangerous. You shouldn't be here. And he says, no, I'm going to fight. Give me a musket. And they give it to him, and he goes into the fort, and there's a big cheer that Dr. Warren is there. He had said a couple of weeks earlier, in a response to hearing that the British said the Americans are not going to fight us, he said, I hope I die up to my knees in blood. That was kind of his retort. Well, he's going to unfortunately get his wish. So he's killed. He's outside the fort at the end. He's trying to rally his men for one more volley, and he gets shot under the eye and he's killed. All right, so he's the most prominent American to die in the battle. The British have now captured the fort. The Americans are fleeing. You know, the people down the hill, the Connecticut and New Hampshire, they have no idea what's going on up there. There's no fighting. They don't know what to do. Now, they cover the men as they're leaving the fort. They provide covering fire. But they're not really involved in the fighting at the end. But word goes out to Howe in the field. We've captured the fort, and Dr. Warren has been killed. And Howe's response is, that can't be right. What would Warren be doing in the fort? You know, he's the head of their government. And he sends up his personal physician, who's been out on the battlefield helping some of the wounded, who goes up, sees Warren, he knows Warren, comes back and tells Howe, it's Warren and he's dead. And Howe says, killing Warren was worth 500 men. That's how much he calls Warren the greatest incendiary in Boston at the time. So we think of Sam Adams and Hancock and all these others, right? But he names Warren as the key person. Unfortunately, the British decimate his body. They decapitate him and they throw him in a mass grave where he stays for the next 9 months until the British are forced out of Boston. The last thing I'll say on this slide, and then I'll move on, is that Prescott makes it all the way back to Harvard Square. He reports to Ward. Ward's not happy. There's been a battle up there. He's been really ticked off. He wasn't planning this. But Prescott says to him, I did everything I could. I stayed as long as I could, but we ran out of ammunition, and I had to leave. But if you give me 1,000 men, muskets and bayonets, I will go back and retake the hill, even if I perish in the effort. Who says something like that, right? He's willing to give up his life to try to get this hill that, you know, a few days earlier nobody cared about. Ward says there's been too much profusion of blood, I'm not going to let you do it, and so the battle ends. Well, this turns out to be the bloodiest battle of the Revolutionary War. It's the first major battle. The British suffer 1,054 casualties. That's 45% of the men that they put into the fight. That's unheard of in this day and age. You know, 10, 15% casualties was kind of routine. You know, once you realize you were overwhelmed, you would retreat. But here, this is just we're standing against each other shooting. Remember, aim for the officers? Of all the British officers who are going to die in the 8 years of the war that are going to come up, about 1 in 7 are killed here in Bunker Hill in 2 hours. Right? It decimates their officer corps. It's a Pyrrhic victory for them. Right? They win the battle, they force the Americans off the peninsula, but at extreme cost. In fact, this quote, a dear-bought victory, another such would have ruined us. That's Henry Clinton, who ended up on the battlefield in the last charge. The Americans suffer about 450 casualties. That's about 25 to 30% of their troops. Here's a quote, I wish we could sell them another hill at the same price. That's Nathaniel Greene, the famous general from Rhode Island, who when he hears about the battle, that's his kind of remark. But I've put down the bottom, I don't know if you can see this in the back, the fellow Colonel Scudieri, he gave me access to some files. The Army keeps a chronological history of their Army. You know, the Army, there's no Army until Washington arrives in Boston, but they have a whole history of the Army. And he said, you know, we didn't spend a whole lot of time writing about Bunker Hill, but I pulled out a couple of quotes, and one of them is, they describe it as a tale of great blunders, heroically redeemed. And he tells me, this colonel, they made so many mistakes. The British made so many mistakes. This was like just a horrible example. And all the people that are killed, the words you see are butchery, slaughter, carnage. Israel Putnam, who's been around a long time, says, I have never seen such carnage in the human race before, as was in this battle. So why is this battle important? When I'm giving this talk up on the hill, you know, everybody's scratching their head saying, we lost this battle. What's so great about that? We built this gigantic monument to a battle we lost. And it is important. Some of the historians I've talked to have said, this is probably one of the top 3 military engagements, fights in the history of the United States Army. And they said, one of them said, there are 3 places you have to go in your lifetime if you're into this. Bunker Hill, Gettysburg, Normandy Beach. They kind of define the American military tradition. And the Americans demonstrated their resolve, their willingness to fight. You know, for a couple of weeks after the battle, some of the leaders in Boston were saying, all right, how did this happen? Warren is dead. You know, we have all these casualties. We've lost the peninsula. Who's responsible for this? But the citizens are very thrilled by the fact we stood up to them. You know, we only lost this battle when we ran out of ammunition. And they're very proud of what they had done. The battle also shows the British that if war comes, it was going to be costly, drawn out, and very difficult for them. You know, before this battle, one of the generals in the British Army says, with 5,000 troops, I will march through the entire Americas, all the colonies, and geld all the males, is what he says. I mean, they're that arrogant. Gage, after this, writes back to the king and says, we're going to need a lot more troops to put these people down. Right? He initially requests 20,000, and they laugh at him. Then it's kind of like, we need 100,000 troops. You know, and they're like, that's ridiculous. You know, these are non-professional soldiers. It affects how the British fought the war. Never again will the British attack an elevated fortified position. Howe, who's going to remain the Major General for a couple more years, will not do it. I mean, he learned his lesson at Bunker Hill. That, you know, this is not. He said afterward, I didn't think the Americans would fight. They fought like devils, is what he says. And it unites the colonies. Washington, who's on his way up from Philadelphia to tell the New England troops, hey, I'm the new commander-in-chief of the Continental Army, right? I'm now your boss. A writer is coming down from Boston. He passes Washington somewhere between Trenton and New York and says, there's been this big battle up in Boston. A lot of people have been killed. And Washington says, the liberties of America are now safe. The British will not win. He's referring to the war that's coming. Which, think of that. He doesn't even have an army yet. Right? It's him. And he's already predicting they're not going to win. Benjamin Franklin also says the British have lost their colonies forever after this battle. So that's why this is important. Okay, here's this very famous, iconic picture. I wanted to bring this up for a couple of reasons. So this is painted by John Trumbull of Connecticut. It's about 10 years after the battle. Trumbull was actually in Roxbury during the battle. He had a regiment before he became a famous painter. His father is, I forget his first name, Trumbull, who is a royal governor in Connecticut. And he's the only royal governor that goes over to the American side. He becomes a very close friend of George Washington, his dad. But anyway, he paints this picture. This one is a large picture. It's like 10 feet by 12 feet. It hangs in Yale University's art gallery. And I want to point out a couple of things. So he's from Connecticut. I've said that a few times, right? So here we have...
What university?
Pardon me?
What university?
Yale.
Yale.
Yale. So this one's hanging in Yale. Here's Warren, you know. This is obviously idealized, right? This isn't how it actually was. But here's Warren dying on the battlefield. This fellow right here, notice he's barefoot. He's meant to be like the everyman, the ordinary soldier who's protecting him. He's putting his hand in front of the bayonet. Behind him, standing here very prominently, is Thomas Knowlton. All right? Connecticut guy. Here's Israel Putnam. Here's Thomas Grosvenor. He's a commander from Connecticut as well. Here's Howe. Here's Clinton. Here's Lord Rawdon, who's credited with having shot Warren. Notice how he doesn't have his face towards the viewer, right? He painted him that way. This is John Pitcairn, who was involved in the Concord alum. He was actually in Lexington when the two sides came together on Lexington Green, and he rides his horse between the British troops and the Americans that are standing there, and he yells, "Put down your arms, you rebel, and disperse!" And they don't do that, right? John Parker says to his men, "Don't move." And then a shot is fired, and they get the volley, and they get 8 killed, 9 wounded. He's one of the first people to try to breach the wall at the third assault, and he's shot down by an African American who's back in here, Peter Salem. He falls down into the arms of his son and dies. His son was part of his troop. But anyway, I'm thinking, where's Prescott? Are you thinking that? Where's the main guy? He is the main commander. Well, you have to kind of look right here over the shoulder of, this is Andrew McClary. You may have seen his name if you've driven through New Hampshire. He's from New Hampshire. He's the last American to be killed in the battle. He's signaling retreat here, holding his musket upside down. But I thought, oh, come on. You have to do better than that than to give him such, little prominence in this picture. But I'll come back to this in a second. Okay, so now my question is, all right, so what happened next? The battle's over. Prescott survived. What did he do? Did he go home? No, he ends up staying around Boston. George Washington is going to arrive on July 3rd, like 3 weeks after the battle. He's making this announcement, okay, you guys all report to me. He's been told he's going to meet the New England Army, and his reaction is less than stellar. He says afterward, you know, I'm not impressed with the troops. They're dirty, they're profane, they drink too much, they're undisciplined. Like, this isn't an army. I have to create an army. So he has to, over the next number of months, organize the troops. One of the people that signs up is Prescott. And Prescott becomes the commander of the 7th Regiment, okay? And he signs up for about an 8-month tour with the new Continental Army. At this point, the Americans are outnumbering the British. Howe and everybody are back in Boston. They're hunkered down. They can't go out into the countryside because all these militia have got the peninsula surrounded. Washington wants to attack them, but he doesn't have any artillery. And his generals keep saying, we can't go in there. They're dug in. They have cannon. He has to wait until he gets some artillery. And that happens when Henry Knox, do you know Henry Knox? Okay. Marches all the way up to Fort Ticonderoga, gets the cannon that were captured there in May. Ethan Allen and the Green Mountain Boys and a Connecticut militiaman by the name of Benedict Arnold go up there and capture the cannon and bring them back. It's a 600-mile trip. Takes them November to the end of January, brings them back, and that's when Washington finally confronts Howe. They don't have a battle, though. Howe says, nope, not going to fight him. If you don't attack us here in Boston, we'll leave the city and we won't burn it down. And that's what happens. The British evacuate on March 17th, which is why it's not only St. Patrick's Day, but it's called Evacuation Day, right? It's when the British leave Boston. Prescott, I found out after much digging, oops, I've done that again. Hang on, going in the wrong direction. Don't look. Prescott is stationed at Sewell's Point. And I've lived in Boston for a long time. I have no idea where that was. When he's first in Washington's army, he's situated in Roxbury, he's situated in Brookline, he's situated in Cambridge. They're kind of moving him around. But at the time this confrontation is going to happen, which is March 5th, it's the anniversary of the Boston Massacre. I think Washington picked that day to confront him. In fact, up on the mountain, up on Dorchester Heights, he says, "Remember this day and avenge the death of your brethren." That's what he tells his troops. I mean, it's like the Braveheart speech or something like that, right? And they end up not fighting. But he's in Sewell's Point, which is today's Kenmore Square. All right, so this is before the Fenway Park was there, obviously. But that's where he's got his troops ready. If there's going to be a fight, he's ready to rush in. But there is no fight. But he's part of the siege. The British leave. I told you that. Okay, so what happens next? What happens to Colonel Prescott? Well, the Americans find out through some informants that Howe is going to leave Halifax, Nova Scotia, where he's taken his now 10,000 troops and about 1,100 loyalists on 110 ships, and they've gone up to Halifax. They find out that Howe is going to try to capture New York City. After the Lexington and Concord fighting in Bunker Hill, the British decided to evacuate New York. They thought, we can't defend the city. We're getting out of here. But Washington's now going to march down and prepare themselves. And it's interesting because Washington doesn't get there until April 14th. I've seen the orders that Prescott gets. It's in late March of 1776. And he marches back to marching again. He marches 200 miles to get to New York. Takes him close to 2 weeks to do that. And ahead of him is General Israel Putnam, the so-called hero of Bunker Hill, who Washington says, take over the defenses of New York. And he sends him down there. Now, to defend New York, that's a Sisyphean task, because where are the British going to attack? This is Manhattan Island here. By the end of the summer, the British have amassed 42,000 troops and sailors. Okay, that's a big number. It's the biggest aggregation of troops in the entire war. They have 425 ships. Just, you know, have you ever seen the USS Constitution down in Charlestown? Imagine 425 of those. They're on Staten Island, they're in Sandy Hook, hanging out, getting ready, but they've been sailing up the Hudson River. here's the East River, here's Brooklyn over here, and where are they going to attack? Washington doesn't know. He thinks they might be coming in from Long Island to Brooklyn and maybe into the city, so he puts half or more than half of his troops in Brooklyn, in here, in Brooklyn Heights. Establishes his headquarters. Actually, my daughter lived in the area for about 15 years, and there's a Trader Joe's there, and on the side of the building, it says, this is where Washington had his headquarters. Now it's a Trader Joe's. But anyway, so what about Prescott? When he arrives, he's down in the Battery area, and I have some notes from his orderly's book describing what they're doing. You know, we're training ourselves, we're making sure that there's not an outbreak of smallpox, some of the soldiers are getting drunk and we're giving them 50 lashes, all these kinds of things. It's kind of, well, we're not fighting yet, so what do we do? And, but Putnam decides that one of the key places to defend the city is Governor's Island. I don't know if you know Governor's Island at all. It's 172 acres. It's a half-mile off the tip of Battery Park in Lower Manhattan. And that's where Prescott gets assigned. Now, this is kind of interesting. How would you like to get that order? We're putting you out here. There are 425 ships in the area, and we want you to build a fortification there. Now, one thing that, maybe this is just my cynical self, but after the Battle of Bunker Hill, Prescott catches up to Putnam, and he confronts him. And he says, you know, Putnam had come up to the redoubt before the battle and said, give me some of your men. I want to take the entrenching tools, the shovels and pickaxes, off here because I don't want the British to capture them. And Prescott's like, no, I'm not sure I want to have any of my men leave here. I'm not in favor of that. And Putnam says, no, we'll come back. Well, they never come back, right? And after the battle, the two of them meet. And Prescott says, like, what's the story? You were supposed to come back with my men. You never did. And Putnam's response is, I couldn't make the dogs go. To which Prescott says, if you had said come, you would have found men enough. That's a pretty biting statement. Stark actually calls Putnam a coward. This is the hero of the Battle of Bunker Hill. You can see this is stuck in my craw a little bit. Anyway, but then Putnam puts him out there. And there are times when the British are bombarding that area. You know, if they could have just annihilated everybody out there if they wanted to. They build a fortification. Actually, Washington shows up at the end of April, beginning of May, and says, we've done some great work here. Prescott has about 400 men. Colonel Nixon has a regiment there. I think there are between 1,000 and 2,000 Americans that are on the island. All right, jump to the end here. The British are eventually going to attack Washington. They're thinking they're going to bag Washington in Brooklyn. Here's where Washington is. Pay no attention to the Brooklyn Bridge. That doesn't get built until much later. This is the only picture I could find that would show this. But he's got his back to the river. I mean, he's kind of trapped. If the British outnumber him 3-1 there, Howe has a group that's 3-1. He's going to attack on August 30th. On the night of August 29th, Washington's generals finally convince him to evacuate Brooklyn. Washington initially doesn't want to go. He said, if I retreat, that's a stain on my honor. All right, this is the 1700s when honor really meant something. He said, you know, I'd rather die on the battlefield than retreat. But they finally convince him, and overnight, there's a famous story, if you know about the evacuation from Brooklyn Heights. If I get renewed, that's going to be season 2 of my story. It's a great story, the Battle of New York. Only about 570 soldiers are killed in that battle compared to Bunker Hill. Anyway, on the morning of the 30th, all the troops have been evacuated off. Washington waits till the last boat to get on. He's rowed across the East River back to Manhattan. And the British don't. They charge. There's nobody there. Right? They're expecting Washington to be there. But what about Prescott? He doesn't get to leave until about 7 o'clock in the morning. All right, the sun is up, and he's very vulnerable out there. Finally, some boats come over. They load their troops, and they get them back to Manhattan. They only suffer one minor casualty. Somebody is hit in the arm, I think, with a shot from one of the British ships. Into the 1900s, they were still finding British cannonballs on Governor's Island. He then evacuates his troops up to Harlem Heights, which is where Washington's eventually going to hang out for the British. Washington gives him a public commendation for the retreat that he's had, so he gets some props there for doing that. Okay, I'm probably going well past my time. Is everybody okay? Mm-hmm. All right, so far so good. This is only the second time I've gone through this, and I sometimes get carried away. So, but it's an interesting story, isn't it? Yeah. Wait till the book comes out. Anyway, here's Prescott's house. I took this picture after meeting with Wendy one day, and went out there to see the old homestead. And the primary reason why I'm putting this up is he retires from the Army in January of 77. Washington is now in New Jersey running for his life. He's being chased by Cornwallis. His army has dwindled down to a few thousand men. And Prescott's tour of duty has ended. He's going to go back home. And so he goes back to Pepperell. And that led me to wonder, well, he was a farmer, so what kind of a farm did he have? What was it like? He only had one son. How did he take care of it? And I'm from New York City. I grew up in the Bronx. I know nothing about agriculture or how to take care of oxen, and know very little about the rigors of life in colonial times. So I got in touch with an old friend and neighbor of mine. I used to live in Westboro for 29 years, and there's a farm there called Nurse Farm, N-O-U-R-S-E. And Jonathan Nurse is the manager of that. It's a 140-acre farm. It was about a mile from where I lived, my wife and I lived. And they're descendants of Rebecca Nurse, who was one of the 25 people who were executed as part of the Salem witch trials. And they had moved out of Salem after 1692 in the witch trials, and they settled in Westboro. And they founded a farm there in 1722. If you do the math, that's 300 years ago. Last year, they had their 300th anniversary. It's the 15th oldest continuously operating farm in the United States. And he's very proud of that. And I spent a day with him, and I said, Jonathan, doing this book, what was it like to be a colonial farmer? Because he's got the history backwards and forwards. And we sat down, and he told me all the rigors of clearing the land, getting the rocks out of the soil, building structures where they could have ice houses to keep, perishables from perishing. It just sounded like, how did they get through the day, We run out of a quart of milk in the house, and it's like, oh my God, I got to walk down to the CVS or something, or pick up some milk. But anyway, what I learned in 1771, there is a tax evaluation for all taxpayers in Massachusetts, and it goes by town, it goes by individual. So you can go right down to the individual household and find out what property did they write about, in this survey. And so this is what I find out about Prescott's farm at the time. It had an annual worth of whole real estate of 8 pounds shilling, 8 pounds sterling, which to me that doesn't sound like a whole lot of money. But it actually put him in the top 10% in Pepperell at the time. And what does that mean? Whole state, do we have any real estate people here? Maybe not. I've been trying to find out what that means. People at the archives have said, we think that means that would be the amount of revenue the land would generate in a year if they were to lease it out, or maybe if they were to sell it. So he's a top landowner here in Pepperell. He's got a horse, 2 oxen, 3 cows, 14 goats and sheep, and 1 swine. He's got various pasture land and tillage and all that stuff. And they produce apples and cider and pears and Indian corn, oats, beans. I see that in his pay book, which I found in the archives in Mass Historical Society. So that's what they were producing at the time. It's really kind of a subsistence farm. It's not like he has it's not like a major agricultural enterprise. But the thing I wanted to point out here is one of the categories is something called servant owner. And they check whether it's yes or no, and they ask a question about, if it's a yes, they ask a question about how many servants they have. Well, servant owner is a euphemism for slave owner, right? And in the 71 valuation, there are no slave owners in Pepperell. And we have Joshua Vollmer over here who's doing a lot of research on this, so he could talk about this more eloquently than I can. But I think there are over 1,300 slave owners in the Commonwealth at the time. And interestingly, if you look at the other Prescotts, it turns out, thank you, Joshua, that Benjamin, in his probate papers, indicates that he had an African-American wench called Peg. So he was a slave owner, which means that William probably, at least for part of his life, grew up with a slave serving the household. James, his older brother, inherits a slave through his marriage into the Lawrence family. And his younger brother, Oliver, in this valuation is listed as a servant owner. So those three all seem to have had a slave or more, but I haven't found any evidence that William did. In fact, there are suggestions that he's an abolitionist, that he was thrilled when Massachusetts banned slavery in the state, and he had written a commendation for, I think it was for Peter Salem from the Battle of Bunker Hill, the African-American soldier that did so well there. Actually, there were about 100 African-Americans at Bunker Hill and a couple of dozen American Indians, so they were like 10% of the force there. It's kind of interesting. Anyway, this is kind of curious. It's an interesting chapter, or at least I find it interesting, so I hope you will too. What happens next? All right, we're almost to the end. We have just a few more slides. Well, Prescott decides to unretire at the age of 51, and he's going to volunteer for Saratoga, the turning point in the war. And what happens is Horatio Gates has got the Northern Army over in upstate New York. John Burgoyne, remember John Burgoyne? He's in Canada. He's going to bring his army of close to 6,000 troops down the Hudson Valley. He recaptures Fort Ticonderoga, and he's on his way down towards Albany. He's planning to meet with General Howe, who's in New York, because they've taken over New York. He's going to come up the Hudson Valley, and they're going to meet, and they're going to cut off the New England colonies from the rest of the states. And that's the plan. Only, unfortunately for John Burgoyne, he doesn't find out until it's too late that Howe has changed his mind. And he does a 180 and heads down to Philadelphia. So here comes Burgoyne with his troops, 6,000 troops. He's moving very fast. He's outrun his supply train, and he gets down to Saratoga, north of Albany. And he's confronted by a large group of American soldiers and volunteers. Now, word had come east that Gates was looking for men. Here's Prescott. He's 51 years old. He volunteers. He comes out of retirement. I've seen the muster rolls at the archives where it lists William Prescott, private number 1. Underneath it says, in parentheses, former colonel. Right? So he joins the Army as a private. Right? He's not in charge of anything. And he's going to march 140 miles to Saratoga. I talked to the senior historian, military historian at the battlefield in Saratoga, and I said, did they really walk all this distance? It's incredible. He said, well, we didn't want to have horses around, right? It's hard to take care of them. You got to feed them. They're a pain in the neck. If somebody came on a horse, they would send them back to their town. Like, forget the horses. We don't want to have to deal with them. So they're walking again, 140 miles. It's going to take him 7 days, maybe more than 7 days. It's the fall of 77, so it's cool nights overnight. They're probably either sleeping, maybe they've found some accommodations along the way, but they're largely sleeping on the ground. They're lucky if they have tents. You know, some of the officers are going to have decent accommodations at the battlefield, but this is a kind of a harsh life. He gets there, they're too late. The two major battles of Bemis Heights and Freeman Farm are over. That's where all the fighting occurs. He arrives, they're too late, but Burgoyne hasn't surrendered yet. And he's getting surrounded. It's a siege of his army. And Prescott is there for the siege, and he's also there to attend the surrender ceremony. So Burgoyne surrenders his army. It's the first time in history that the British Army has ever surrendered on the battlefield. And it turns out to be the turning point in the war, because the French are going to come in on the American side. And with their navy and everything, now we've got some real support. But I'll point out here, here's another picture a John Trumbull picture down here. This one, Surrender of John Burgoyne, it hangs in the rotunda in Washington, D.C., along with 2 other Trumbull paintings. And they're huge. They're like 12 feet by 14 feet, big ones. And if you look really closely, oh, damn it. Sorry. I keep doing that. I just bought this thing like a week ago, so that's my problem. Right here, over the shoulder, is William Prescott. All right? Here's Horatio Gates. This is actually truncated a little bit. John Stark is over here in the picture. So he's there. Over here, this is Philip Schuyler. I don't know if anybody, did you see the musical Hamilton? The Schuyler sisters? Okay, so Philip Schuyler, he's there. But this fellow Eric Schnitzer, who's the military historian, said, I can't figure out why Prescott is in this picture. You know, he probably never fired his weapon. He didn't command any troops. He was there. We know he was there. But I wonder why. And I said, well, I've read a book about John Trumbull. And it turns out that he felt so embarrassed that he didn't put Prescott in the Warren painting that he decided to put him in this painting. So that's how William gets in here. Okay? All right, let's move forward here. 10 years later, it's Shays' Rebellion. A fascinating time in the Commonwealth. This is an uprising that's largely fueled by veterans of the war. You know, they didn't get to keep up their income when they were fighting the revolution. And now here it is years later. Many of them are in debt. The courts are, you know, taking them in. They're arresting people if they can't pay their debts, or they're forcing the farmers to sell their farms to pay it off. They're asking to settle these debts in specie, you know, the hard currency, which nobody seems to have. And this gets a number of people very angry, including Daniel Shays, who's out in the Springfield area. And Shays and his men start closing down some of the courts and saying, well, we're not going to allow this anymore. One of the areas that's under duress is the Concord courthouse. All right, this has happened in Worcester, it's happened out in Berkshire County, it's happened in Taunton, different areas around the state. But local resident Job Shattuck is one of the prominent people as part of Shays' Rebellion here in Concord. And he's got between 200 and 300 insurrectionists who are trying to shut down the courts. They're really opposing the government, and it's a significant uprising. What does Prescott do? He's 60 years old now. He rides down to Concord. All right, he's going to get himself involved. He's not invited. He goes down there, but his 2 brothers, Oliver and James, they're judges. They're judges in the Court of Appeals and Common Pleas, and he's basically supporting them and opposing this action, which was very controversial because this part of the country, and in fact most of the West, were supporting what Shays was doing. And he gets down there, he becomes part of a committee to help find a solution to the controversy, and he ends up negotiating with his former officer, because he had recruited Job Shattuck as part of the French and Indian War, obviously a neighbor and now insurgent. And there's an exchange that's very telling, and I've seen it both at the archives and some other books, of them writing to each other and trying to settle this thing out. The court is shut down, but violence is averted. I mean, there are some people, they're armed. These men are armed and ready for whatever was going to occur. But he shows up on the scene and with these other men, quells the uprising there. Okay, here's the last major action for Prescott that I've come across. Because of Shays' Rebellion, people like George Washington and James Madison in particular get very worried. They've been worried for a while that the Articles of Confederation, which is the form of government that's been in effect since the early 80s, it isn't really strong enough to help us create a prominent world power government. And they've been talking about, we need to hold a convention and come up with a new constitution. And part of the impetus for that is Shays' Rebellion here in Massachusetts. And There are 70 delegates from around the colonies that are nominated to go to Philadelphia. Only 55 show up at one point or another. They're not all there all the time. Some of them come, stay a week or two, then they go, come back. And there's a blackout on news. Washington, who's the president of the convention, says, no leaks, all right, no leaks. And so they don't report to the press. They're there from the middle of May to September 17th, when they finally leave the State House with the Constitution written. So here's Prescott back here. Here's something I don't know. Maybe I can deputize you all and you can help me find out. I'm dying to find out what his reaction was to the Constitution coming out. My guess is that he would have been a supporter of that, given some of the other things that he's done and Shays' Rebellion and so forth. But it's unknown how he reacts. You know, these notes here in the library, they're pretty straightforward. You know, on this date, these people got together, William Prescott presiding, and here are all these other people, and we came out with this letter. But there's nothing that says, here's how we felt about this, or, you know, we took a vote and it was unanimous, or whatever it was. What he does learn is that Elbridge Gerry, one of the 4 delegates from Massachusetts, you know, we get the term gerrymandering from him, he does not sign the Constitution. And again, I'm wondering, what do you think about that? Somebody from Massachusetts not signing it. Washington and Madison were afraid if Massachusetts did not ratify, and they're the 6th state to ratify, and they need 9 for it to be put into effect. But if Massachusetts doesn't do it, is Virginia, New York, Rhode Island, New Hampshire, some of the ones that haven't voted yet, they feel like it's going to fail. So it's so critical what happens here in Massachusetts. And it's curious that he ends up not signing. Elbridge Gerry goes on to be in the House of Representatives. He's our 5th vice president, and he becomes governor of Massachusetts. So even though he didn't sign the Constitution, it worked out pretty well for him, I would say, after all that. But here in Pepperell, Prescott takes part in the decision of who to send. Each town could send the number of representatives that are in the General Assembly to a convention that's going to be held at the end of January and into the early part of February of '88. And Deacon Daniel Fisk from Pepperell is sent off. Now, some of the towns, I found out, instructed their representative what to do. You're going to vote yay, you're going to vote nay, whatever. I don't see any evidence that they told Fisk what to do. Some of the towns say, why don't you go listen to the debate and decide what's best? Anyway, we have this convention. Daniel Fisk votes nay. All right, so the town of Pepperell voted nay. The 2 representatives from Groton both voted nay. In fact, Middlesex County as a whole, 17 yay, 25 nay. Interesting. Worcester, 7 yay, 43 nay. Where's my little booklet? I forget all the numbers. Oh, here, I have it right here. Give me 1 second. See if I can find this quickly. Yeah, I heard it. It's on the back page. Okay. Hampshire County, 19 yay, 33 nay. Berkshire County, 7 yay, 15 nay. You get a pattern here? It's sort of like the center of the state, west. It does pass. 187 to 168, 19 vote difference. So if 10 people had switched, Massachusetts would not have ratified the Constitution. What brings them over the line? Suffolk County, 34 yay, 3 nay. Essex County, 38 yay, 3 nay. And Plymouth County, 21 yay, 6 nay. So the eastern counties are really what pulls Massachusetts across the finish line. I'll just finish this by saying New Hampshire, which is going to be the 9th one that's going to take us over the top, 57 yay, 47 nay, 10 votes. 6 people switch. That's Virginia, 89 yay, 79 nay. Again, very close. New York, 30 yay, 27 nay. You're on a cutting edge here. Rhode Island, who's been recalcitrant through this whole process. They don't show up in Philadelphia. They want to be by themselves. They don't like a lot of this that's going on. They've actually voted against this earlier by an overwhelming majority, like 10 to 1 nay. But they come back and they're the 13th to ratify. 34 yay, 32 nay. So think how close we were to not having the Constitution. It's pretty remarkable. I wish I knew how Prescott reacted to all of that. So starting tomorrow, you're all going to be out there. Okay. I won't spend time here. This is the graves, right, for the Prescotts, and that's what it says on his stone. I will mention that his wife outlives him by 21 years, and she dies at 89 years old. That's pretty amazing. He dies at, in his 70th year, as they say, he's 69. So what did he witness and miss? At the end of it, I'm saying, okay, so he spent a large portion of his life, right, fighting for personal freedom, liberty, self-determination. Would he have been happy? He's, on his deathbed, let's say. How does he feel about it all? He's fought multiple occasions, and I think he would have been pretty satisfied, because what he witnesses is the establishment of a new form of government. So he's around to see this Constitution, very strong centralized government, be put in place. He witnesses the election of George Washington, his former commander-in-chief, as president. In fact, he dies in Washington's second term. He sees the stabilization of the economy. There's a big battle between Thomas Jefferson, the agrarian, and Alexander Hamilton, who's more for a mixed economy, but he's really pushing manufacturing. And he convinces Washington, this is what we need. We need a strong economy, not based just on agriculture. So he sees all that happen, and I think he would be pleased that all of his efforts were not in vain. What he's not around for, and what I think he would have been upset about, is there's a second war of independence. We call it the War of 1812. So he might have thought that after 8 years of fighting the British and everything that happened there, we were done with the British. It was over. But no, the British are going to come over and fight us again. And in 1814, I think it is, they capture Washington, D.C., burn down the Capitol and the White House, right? So I don't think he would have found that to be too good. The other one I put up here is the Missouri Compromise. So that's the Compromise of 1820. It's when Maine breaks off from Massachusetts and becomes its own free state, but Missouri comes in as a slave state. And it establishes the 38th parallel as the dividing line between free territory and slave territory. So it's allowing slavery to be extended. And if it's indeed the case, and I have no reason to suspect it wouldn't be, I think he would have been really disappointed that at this point slavery hadn't been outlawed yet. Okay, I'm done with my slides. I have more things here, some of these quotes if you want to stay around, what people had to say about him. Do you want to stay 5 minutes more?
Yeah.
Are you tired? Everybody's saying, hey, this was supposed to be an hour. Praise for Prescott at Bunker Hill. I think some of these are fantastic. To be plain, it appears there was never more confusion and less command. No one appeared to have any command but Colonel Prescott, whose bravery can never be enough acknowledged and applauded. And that's a note from somebody by the name of J. Pitts to Samuel Adams. You can see it's July of 75. How about this one? Light Horse Harry Lee, the father of Robert E. Lee. When future generations shall inquire, where are the men who gained the highest prize of glory in the arduous contest which ushered in our nation's birth? Upon Prescott and his companions in arms will the eye of history beam. Whew, man, that's powerful. And down at the bottom here, William Tecumseh Sherman, from Civil War fame. If there is any glory in that day, it is because we had on that day commanding men unused to military orders, unwilling to do anything for a master, but ready to do all for a leader. I have a chapter in the book called Leadership, Bravery, and Decision-Making, and I kind of just focus on that aspect of him. Dedication of the statue, 1881. Here's Robert Winthrop, famous lawyer from Massachusetts, one-time Speaker of the House of Representatives. Prescott with his little band is seen standing undaunted at bay, displaying still as ever a coolness and self-possession that would do honor to the greatest hero of any age. And I'll finish with this one. And by place, this is Daniel Webster, who spoke both at the, when they laid the cornerstone in 1825 and then came back in 1843 with the completion of the monument, and he's speaking at the commemoration of the statue. By placing the statue of Colonel William Prescott in the very front of our noble monument, thus recognizing him in his true relation to the grand action which it commemorates, and of which he was nothing less than the commander, because there was a big debate about who was the commander here. And some people said it was Israel Putnam. if it was proper to give the battle a name, it should be called Prescott's Battle. All right? Thank you very much for your attention.